Today's World Insight. The U.S. election in the eyes of the next generation. For young Chinese, what's at stake? Their fears and hopes.
One of the biggest social experiments ever in history to reflect about, what is democracy and where should we go next?
I care more about the future border policies.
The way they present themselves on the screen get them to target the audiences that they want to target.
Already some psychological studies of the candidates.
And with Americans heading to the polls after millions of early votes in, what direction will the winning candidate likely set for the U.S.? What does it mean for the Asia-Pacific region? Answers from Professor Kishore Mahbubani.
American policies in US-China now enjoy bipartisan support.
Here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. We're going to focus our attention today on the U.S. election. Young voters are poised to be a decisive force, many believe, in the 2020 election, with data suggesting record turnout from the group. So how does the young generation see the election? What about young people here in China? And what do they think about an election taking place on the other side of the Pacific? Earlier, I spoke to 4 of them who have been actually studying or living in the U.S. earlier. But before our conversation, let's listen to this first. Youth voters, defined at the age of 18 to 29 years old, generally turn out much less than other age groups, as was the case in 2016. But then, in 2018, we are seeing a very different picture. If you look at this, we are showing right here a youth wave emerged with historically high number of young people voting in the year 2018 in the midterm election. That youth wave is expected to resurge in 2020 presidential election. Non-Americans will also be watching the election very closely, and they are looking at the general picture inside the U.S. Among them are vast numbers of Chinese students who are studying in the U.S. or who are planning to do so. Faced with hostile policies and a pandemic, though, many of them are losing hope for an American higher education. But if you look at this graphic, you would certainly have a clear understanding about how many Chinese students actually are there in the U.S., particularly how they are compared in numbers to the others from different parts of the world. How much is at stake? How are young people taking the U.S. election that is days away? I talked to some of them, and let's find out their thoughts. And I'm so happy to be joined by a very young panel with me, Yunxin, Zichun, Yinor, and Yang Fan. Good to see you guys. I want to thank all of you because I know you all went to sleep last night very late, right? You better tell our audience why is that, and why is it related to what we're going to talk about today?
I slept yesterday at 1 a.m. I was having a meeting with people all over the world, so.
Online meeting.
Yeah, online meeting.
Yeah.
I went to sleep at 3 a.m. Because I got out of the lab at 2 a.m.
I went to sleep at 3 a.m. I had a meeting as well. Yeah.
5 a.m.
This is quite a competition.
Yeah, there's a very popular phrase right now called 打工人, but I have to say the hours of entrepreneur is much worse. Yeah.
So we are gathering here because we are all enthusiastic about what's to come after U.S. election, right? I know you guys have also been giving some thoughts to it. Tell me how that topic is being discussed among you, supposedly Chinese young people. Yang Fan?
For me, entrepreneur in the international education industry, I care more about the future border policies. Because we know during the past year, because of the pandemic, a lot of students cannot go to U.S. They have to take the Zoom University. And we've heard a lot of the dramas. Yes, a couple months ago, the ICE policy influenced a lot of Chinese overseas students. I'm worrying about an unstabilized border policy if Trump continues his presidency.
So you think the other candidate will make a difference?
They will still try to reestablish their leading position in the global trading system, but I believe education part will be much better than right now. Yeah.
So the young entrepreneur is already thinking about what's next in terms of business, right?
Yeah.
The prospect of business. What about for you? The both of you are still in school. Inwa.
I'm a psychology major at Cornell, so I really want to focus on how the two candidates, they appeal to their audience, like their targeted voters. So in terms of Trump and Biden, I think that Trump has a really strong personality. Also, I'm thinking,
to say the least, my dear.
So in terms of personality psychology, what I think is that the way he presents himself, he chooses to brand himself and present an image as being quite very extroverted and very, you can say disagreeable, and very strong in terms of his opinions. So in this case, he's trying to appeal to the audience of, I mean, his voters compared to Joe Biden are less educated. And also in terms of Joe Biden, it's really interesting how he presents himself as a person who is very compassionate. I mean, he might is a person who is very compassionate, but he presents himself that way as well. And so Joe Biden, on the opposite, he presents himself to be a very mannered, quite agreeable person. But in terms of psychology, I think if you pull back from how they appear on the screen in terms of how they really are behind the screen, I think that maybe their personality might be similar in terms of how good or bad they are, but the way they present themselves on the screen get them to target the audiences that they want to target.
Already some psychological studies of the candidates. What about for you?
Oh, I'd actually like to start with a story. You know, I have this kind of, I guess, thing I do where I talk to taxi drivers all over the place. I assume various roles, and I like to ask them about world issues. And funny thing,
how many taxi rides you had recently?
A lot. But funny thing, the common denominator for all these taxi drivers is that they're actually very concerned about this election. And obviously, they're going to give the spiel where America's a mess right now. So I guess what I'm saying is, really, a lot of people are thinking about the results of this election, and it does matter a lot. But for me, though, I kind of try to have an outside perspective of this election. I think this is one of the biggest social experiments ever in history. So I think this is a perfect time for us as learners to reflect about, you know, what is democracy, and where should we go next?
Interesting. I know you are also now choosing a major of politics.
Yes.
In recent year, right?
Yes.
Wow, it's a very interesting time for you to look at that. And what about for you?
For
we
me,
are looking at the numbers in the office.
Yeah. I do remember, in 2016, which is when I was still in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where at Harvard Kennedy School, they had a live broadcasting about the final election results, which is Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton. And at the time, I remember basically every one of my friends they're so ready for Hillary, and the media all portrays Hillary is going to be the first female president ever in the United States. But that night didn't went well that way, right? And we have that celebration ready and balloons, everything. But then, with Trump winning Florida, we thought our dreams just shattered right in front of our eyes. And now it's 4 years later, I am now sitting in Beijing and thinking about the 4 years how Donald Trump has transformed or changed American politics landscapes. And now I think more than ever, including me or my American friends or international friends as well, they're all very concerned about this election.
You're all here in China for various reasons. You are here studying and staying with your family, right? Even though you're an American citizen, but you're working here, you're studying here, and you're working here. Right. So for various reasons, what do you make of this, so-called China factor in the campaigns by the two candidates? And do you think it's fair China is being portrayed in the way they did? Do you think that should be the way, or should be the amount of attention paid to China by U.S. politicians, whether it is in this campaign or after the election result comes out?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. Well, I guess if I ask the taxi drivers, they would probably respond by saying, China is a growing force, and it's inevitable. And for that sentiment, I'd have to agree with them. The China factor, I think, in their discourse is inevitably, it's inevitable.
This political major person is trying to hide his opinion behind the opinions of the taxi drivers. That's a very smart way of doing it. Yeah.
But yeah, China is a growing power in international politics. And for me, it's actually very disheartening to see that they're drawing this dichotomy between the US and China as two opposing superforces. So I think, from the American perspective, it's going to come out. In the presidential debates, they've talked a lot about China as a growing force and how to repress them. Both candidates, if elected, I believe will continue on with this narrative about repressing China. And I think that's really inevitable. But from a grander perspective, taking a step back, this is really something I don't hope to see. Because we're already seeing, like Yang Fan talked about earlier, for us as students, as people who are trying to make a difference in the world, it's making life more difficult for us.
Do you talk about that with your friends, or with your, classmates, those that are in the U.S.?
Yeah, for sure. They're actually super nice about it, and for that, I'm very grateful. They've been checking in on me. After ICE, the ICE thing, a lot of them have texted me and asking me if I was okay. And it really depends on which group of people you're talking to, because America is such a polarized country right now.
Yeah.
So in California, I'm really grateful to have a group of people who are open and who are willing to discuss with me.
In terms of this, I really agree with what Zizhui is saying. So no matter who wins the election, I think that the relationship between the U.S. and China will definitely not be as good as during Obama's presidency, let's say. But however, like from a grand perspective, in the long run, let's say if Biden wins the election, well, he will probably have a closer relationship with China in comparison to Trump, just because he focuses more on the environmental issues. So in terms of this, they may collaborate with China between the countries. And in terms of Trump, he is a businessman, right? So he knows his calculations, and he knows that in terms of the global economy, it has to be global in order for every country to boom, right, for their economy. So I think in the long run, no matter how the relationship between China and the U.S. is right now, in the long run, definitely as exchange students studying abroad in the U.S., we are contributing to the U.S. economy, and they are helping us as well. So it's a win-win situation in terms of this.
Yang Fang, I know many of your friends have already come back to China because of COVID-19. And your company, small one, last time I checked it, now already become an entrepreneurship of 300 or 400 people.
Yes.
It's enlarging very fast. So tell me about how do they feel, and how do you feel about this U.S.-China thing,
Yeah, I believe China is an inevitable topic for U.S. election, because both of the candidates are portray themselves as be tough on China. So I believe, but there's still a difference. I think Trump is treating China, Biden is treating China as a competitor. So I believe competitor is still different with enemy. Competitor, we still can have collaborations, still have competition together. But in terms of enemy, there's less cooperation, there's less trust, less mutual understanding. I believe that these are totally different. The education in China is also growing very fast. We have our own top high-end institution, and maybe after many years, the top choice for Chinese elite students are not studying abroad, but stay in China and work in China, and to output our Chinese values to the world.
You all talk about your own sense, how you're making sense of the current situation. What about people around you?
When I was still at Cornell before the pandemic, before coming back to China, I really think that, well, first, in terms of coronavirus, which Trump says is the virus from China, I don't think that those around me are in any way presenting unfriendliness towards Chinese students at all. So in terms of that, it's really good. Like the culture at Cornell, at least, is really friendly.
We all believe that the leadership of America will try to distract the attention of their citizens and put the pressure more on China, because they will have to transfer the attention to outside conflicts. We have to be adaptive. We have to think one step earlier about this. What if it's just happened? And we have to have more choice, have other ways to get about the knowledge, to learn about the technology. And because of the pressure right now, we can see Chinese companies like TikTok, like Huawei, they are making different strategies right now. I think it's a challenge, but it's also, there are opportunities in it. It's opportunity for China, for Chinese company to make their own leeways.
Including yours?
Yeah, including mine. Yeah, because we are thinking about other revolutionary business model right now.
Which you wouldn't reveal to us. I could sense that. What about for you, Yuanxin?
So I definitely think there's a lot of enthusiasm, there's a lot of confusion, and especially I think after COVID, when Donald Trump has repeatedly saying, you know, this is a virus from China, this is a Chinese plague, I think it's definitely like hurt our feelings, of course, we as like Chinese people, or especially I think a lot of my friends, Asian American friends, they definitely feel more threatened, and this is not a good place to be in at this moment. So.
Take my dad as an example. I go home every day, and what he tells me is, son, look at America. There's another 80,000 cases on the rise. So I think from people around me, they're starting to get nonchalant about how things are going. They're constantly focusing on how the election is going, but somehow they're already numb about the way America is progressing. And that kind of concerns me too, because there is a rise of hostility between Chinese people to how America is, and American people to how China is. And I think for us as the young generation, like what Yuanxin was talking about earlier, you know, it really is our duty to reshape the public discourse on this respect. Because with this trend, you know, it's not going to be good for anybody, for international students, for businesses. So it's really up to us to educate ourselves and to influence the people around us to reshape the public discourse.
But how? I mean, I can't travel to the U.S. right now. How would you do it? And how do you think we should be able to do it? When you talk about people-to-people, person-to-person communication, when you talk about what's going on in the other parts of the world, when you talk about how should we relate to them?
Yeah, it seems like many times when American people are talking about China or Chinese people talking about America, they are not talking about exactly the country or the people. They're talking about like some of their own, like say, some information, second-hand information, like plus their own self-projections in the sense. So I guess what Yang Fan just said about like mutual understanding and keeping an open mind, I think it is vital to have this mindset first to be in any kind of like meaningful discourse and conversations, so that you have to understand each other better, even if sometimes it makes you kind of uncomfortable and feel like this is something your culture wouldn't be doing, or this is something you wouldn't really do.
What's so interesting about humanities or politics that's different from, you know, technology and science is that there is no true answer. It's really up to you to decide what is the most appropriate way to interpret a situation.
And it could change from time to time.
Exactly. So that's why I urge, you know, people who are watching this. I'm a STEM major who always thought that I was going to study science my whole life. But reading about politics, reading about news, and getting aware of the world really truly makes a difference to me as a person.
You all talk about the mutual understanding. That's, to me, also extremely crucial. What if people don't believe you? What if people think you have an agenda? What if they talk about different kinds of scenarios as if there were conspiracies here and there all the time? You know, what are you going to do about that? What if you explain and they don't listen?
This kind of happened when, again, it was just before the pandemic, how Cornell closed and everyone had to go home. I was having the discussion with my U.S. friends, and then we were talking about how classes are ending and how serious this coronavirus pandemic is. And how my U.S. friends responded was that they thought that there was no point in closing down the schools, and they were kind of angry for having to go to Zoom University. So in terms of this, I found it to be pretty challenging, but what I did was the best that I could, sharing my first-hand experience with them.
And keep on doing that.
Yeah.
And for you?
It doesn't render the endeavor, meaningless, even though there are frustrating times.
At the end of our discussion, I really want you, well, I only have 4 young people, but in a way representing many of your friends, help us to understand to both the Chinese and the future U.S. leadership that are likely to come into the office after this election, what do you think they need to do? What matters the most to you? The thing that you think the 2 leaders or the leadership on both sides need to do?
I think leadership is not about you singly stand out. It's about you champion for all groups of interest.
Make education more important in the country?
Oh, I'd say in the long run, definitely there should be just a better relationship. It's just a win-win situation.
I think it's built friendship with all the global players.
Thank you so much. Yang Fan, Yino, Zichun, and Yunshin. Really appreciate it. You guys are great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My conversation with young people here in China, their views about the ongoing U.S. election. You're watching World Insight. Coming up on our program today, with Americans heading to the polls and millions having already voted, what direction will the winning candidate set for the U.S.? What does it mean for the Asia-Pacific region? I speak to a well-known scholar, Kishore Mahbubani, right after this break.
American policies in US-China now enjoy bipartisan support.
Welcome back. This is World Insight with me, Tian Wei. With the 2020 U.S. presidential election pitting 2 radically different visions against each other, the race to the White House this year is all set to be a watershed moment in the nation's history. Throughout his first term, President Trump has been intent on reshaping American government and refocusing its foreign policy in an unprecedented manner. Now, the whole world is watching which direction the U.S. goes next. So what does the election mean for the U.S. and other countries around the world, especially for this region, Asia-Pacific? Earlier, I had the chance to talk to Kishore Mahbubani, Distinguished Fellow from the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. Here's his take. And I'm joined with honor by Kishore Mahbubani, Distinguished Fellow from Asia Research Institute with National University of Singapore. Professor Mafubani, what a pleasure to see you.
Pleasure to be with you again.
Professor Mafubani, how certain do you think we can be about a smooth process for the U.S. presidential election this year?
Oh, I think we certainly cannot be confident of any kind of smooth process in the U.S. this year because, I've been following the U.S. for clearly almost 50 years now. And this is the most divided, the most polarized, the most troubled United States of America that I have seen in my lifetime. So I think you're seeing a very highly charged political atmosphere in the United States today. And it is, sadly, we are more likely to see a very difficult, challenging outcome rather than a clear country by either Trump or Biden.
Many suggest that this has a lot to do with the divide that has been there with the U.S. Over the past 1 decade or 2. Some also suggest that there is a need to have an autopsy, quote-unquote, of the U.S. election system. So do you think these are necessary? And what do you think are the fundamental problems hidden behind the great divide you've been talking about?
Well, I would use the word autopsy. Autopsy is only done for dead bodies. The United States political body is still very much alive and well and kicking. But certainly something has gone profoundly wrong within American society and in the United States, which used to be a democracy, which is a government of the 100%, by the 100%, for the 100%. And today, United States sadly has become a plutocracy. Plutocracy is the government of the 1%, by the 1%, for the 1%. So the elites in the United States have done very well over the last 30, 40 years. But the bottom 50% in the United States has been going down over a 30-year period. And I think what the United States needs to do is to examine why is it the case that the livelihood of the bottom 50% hasn't gone up. And the simple answer I give is that the United States has become a plutocracy. And I think the more and more the Americans recognize that it has become a plutocracy, the more likely it is they can find a solution to that problem. And so I hope after the elections, there'll be deeper reflections within the American body politic on what has really gone wrong in the United States, because something clearly has gone wrong. It is a very troubled society today.
How much do you think then, Professor, the choices made by the American voters and the electoral system this time will impact the direction of the world?
Well, I think there's no doubt that the election of an American president has a profound impact on the world. And then, for example, I mean, we have learned that when President Donald Trump was elected president in November 2016, exactly 4 years ago, he proved to be a very disruptive president. I mean, clearly the erratic trade war that he launched with China has not just damaged China, it has actually damaged the entire East Asian region, and in many ways the whole world, because the whole global economy slowed down as a result of the trade war that President Trump launched. And sadly also, the incompetent management of COVID-19 by the Trump administration has also damaged American society, American economy, and that has also slowed down global economic growth. So it is a fact that it does matter a lot the choice that is made by the United States. And this is why I hope that if, for example, America chooses Joe Biden as the president, and I hope the polls are right and that he's chosen, then you will see a calming effect on the world, because the disruptive actions of the Trump administration will come to a halt.
Professor Mahbubani, some suggest there is an interesting divide also about how within the United States the debate has been and how it is being perceived outside that country. There seems to be also a huge divide between what people perceive America should be like and what the United States now is like.
Yes, I mean, it is a fact. I mean, I'm not giving any secrets away that the standing and prestige of the United States has come down significantly since President Trump was elected president. You can see this in the
and therefore, and therefore, Professor, is it naive? Is it naivete, some would say, for people from outside the United States expected to be more rational, to be more logical, to be more international, multinational? Is it naive or wishful thinking from outside the country? Of course, the election result will tell us, but still, at this stage, it's an interesting question, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It is. But I think you're absolutely right. And as you know, my very first comment for 50 years, I haven't seen it as divided, as polarized and as troubled as it is today. But I do believe at the same time that Biden will try his best to try and restore a certain degree of sanity in the American decision-making process. I think there'll be a lot of resistance by the Republicans. A lot depends on, by the way, a lot depends on whether or not the Democrats can win both if they win the presidency, whether or not they can win the House. I think they're likely to keep the House, and whether or not they can also win the Senate. If the Democrats can win the House, the Senate, and have the presidency, then I think you will see a certain ability for the country to come together and fix some serious problems.
On the other hand, what does it mean, the election result of this presidential election in the U.S. For Asia-Pacific region, particularly ASEAN countries, where you are?
And I think, a former Indonesian ambassador to the United States, a friend of mine, his name is Dino Jalal, wrote an excellent article on in the magazine called The Diplomat, saying that he hoped that the Trump administration is noticing that no Southeast Asian country is enthusiastic about these geopolitical contests, which I discussed in my book, As China Won, that the United States has launched against China. He says nobody's enthusiastic about it. The Southeast Asian countries have other priorities. They want to focus on economic development, on social development, and the last thing the Southeast Asian countries want is the continuation of a very disruptive trade war and geopolitical contest that the United States has engaged in under the Trump administration. So I suspect that the ASEAN countries will be quietly happy to see a more stable and predictable administration in Washington, D.C.
There is already some apparent division going on in the Asia-Pacific region, to say the least. For example, Japan, Australia, together with the United States, forming the so-called the Quad. And there were talks about more countries joining in, or desire for more countries to joining in. Those names certainly could include some of the ASEAN countries, as Washington would hope. On the other hand, we also see ASEAN at the time trying to struggle with a right consensus. Professor, what do you make of that? What would this election and the foreign policy direction of the U.S. mean?
Well, I mean, I've been studying geopolitics all my life. And geopolitics is, as you know, the traditions goes back thousands of years. And as you know, our friend Graham Allison's written a book that whenever a new power emerges, the established power tries to push it down. So this is also what I document in my book, As China Won, which is that as China is emerging and about to surpass the United States is trying to push China down. And that's logical behavior in some ways, and the United States is looking for allies, and so it has tried to use the Quad. But since you focus on ASEAN, I think it is very unlikely, I may be wrong, but it's very unlikely that any ASEAN country will join the Quad. Because from the point of view of the ASEAN countries, it's very important that they have good relations with their most important neighbor. Their most important neighbor with whom they trade the most by far is China. And the ASEAN countries also want to have a good relation with the United States. And I think it's very clear that the ASEAN countries don't want to be caught taking sides in this contest. So unlike the members of the Quad, I think you'll find the ASEAN countries will be far more careful and pragmatic in their calculations.
And it's interesting, Professor, you have noticed that both the EU and ASEAN and some of the other players are trying to be this middle ground between two powers, China and the United States. But it takes more than two to tango, I know that, but it also takes the parties involved have the willingness to be supported by others in order to find the common ground. So how do you think this U.S. presidential election will be able to help others to understand whether the parties involved really want the future that you have enthusiastically trying to support them with?
Well, I think a lot will depend, Tianwei, on whether or not Trump wins or Joe Biden wins. If Trump wins, then I'm afraid that you are right. We are likely to see more and more disruptions. And in fact, a leading figure in the West, I cannot quote him, sure, if Donald Trump is re-elected as president, the West is dead. Because, you know, a lot of allies of the United States, especially in Europe, cannot work with a president like Trump who keeps changing, chopping, changing. It's very, very difficult. Whereas, by contrast, I think if Joe Biden is elected, you will see the American alliances becoming stronger because Joe Biden is a very traditionalist American politician, and you will find the United States going back to working with its allies in Europe. And the good news about that is that the Europeans will then tell the United States, you have to go back to the Paris Climate Accords, you know. And I think it's good for us if the United States actually comes back into the game on climate change, because the world will be worse off if the United States stays away. So in that sense, the election of a president makes a huge difference on which direction the U.S. will go.
The other thing we have noticed is the two candidates have been using different degrees of so-called blaming China as the campaign strategy. One possibly is much more ardent in using it than the other. Professor Mafubani, so far, do you think that strategy has worked, both for American voters, if you look at the polls and the priorities of the election issues, and also for the others who are watching the election very closely around the world?
As you know, American policies towards China now enjoy bipartisan support. And what is actually strange is that on everything that President Trump does, the Democrats oppose him, except when he can trade war with China, then the Democrats support him. And so there's a bipartisan consensus there. So it is quite natural for both Democrats and Republicans to attack China in the U.S. presidential election. But I would say that China should not listen to what they say in the presidential election. Because the American presidential candidates have a track record of walking away from what they say in the presidential election. So don't listen to what they say in the campaigns. Watch what they do when the campaign is over. But at the same time, it's also clear that both China and the United States have to sit down and negotiate very hard a new understanding between the two powers. And I'm actually optimistic that at the end of the day, if the United States focuses on improving the well-being of its people and China focuses on improving the well-being of its people, then China and the US can cooperate to improve the well-being of their people. And that's what we should try to achieve after this presidential election race is over.
I want to move on about some subjects that are related to China-US relations and also probably related to the policy tools the new coming president of the US, whether it's one or the other, could work on, for example, about technology, for example, about trade policy, for example, about multilateral platforms. So how do you see, Professor, if you were giving advice to a president who might be listening to advice, what would you say about these areas?
Well, I would say each of these issues, trade, technology, multilateral institutions, each has got its own dynamic. And on trade, it's very clear that the United States will be better off if it engages in more trade rather than less trade with the East Asian region. And you know, as you know, the 21st century will be the Asian century. I've been predicting this for 30 years now. So, you have, if the United States walks away from Asia, it is damaging its economy. On technology, you will see, I don't have good news on technology. I have bad news, that the technological competition will become more fierce, because the United States is very frightened that if it loses its technological edge, then it will fall behind. So the United States will fight very, very hard to keep its technological edge, because that's ultimately the most powerful weapon that the United States has. But on multilateral institutions, I'm more hopeful. I think since China is the #1 trading power in the world by far, it is in China's interest to see the United States come back to the World Trade Organization, and European Union, ASEAN, Japan. Everybody wants the United States to come back and engage the World Trade Organization.
Professor Kishore Mahbubani, as always, what a pleasure. Thank you for sharing your insights.
Thank you.
My earlier conversation with Kishore Mahbubani. That's all we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to search World Insight. Check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.